Knowing the conjugations of reflexive verbs is nice, but it doesn't mean very much unless we talk about how they're actually practically applied in various situations. So there's a few different usages and rules that we need to know about reflexives. One thing is that we have to understand that not all verbs are reflexive. There are verbs that are reflexive, and there are verbs that are not reflexive. There are also verbs that can be both, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But you can't simply take a verb, any verb you want, that is not reflexive and choose to make it reflexive. For instance, you cannot take the verb comer and throw an se at the end and make it comerse. That verb does not exist. We do not eat ourselves. So again, there are certain verbs that are reflexive. There are certain verbs that are not reflexive. There are some verbs that are both, which we'll talk about in a minute, but we cannot take a non-reflexive verb and make it reflexive. So the question becomes, how do we convey the idea of a verb being reflexive if the verb is not reflexive? In other words, how do we express the idea of self if the verb is not reflexive? For instance, if we wanted to use the verb dar, maybe to convey the idea that people are maybe giving something to each other. Dar is not a verb that is reflexive, unless it's darse cuento, which is a completely different verb and it means to realize. But let's say we were talking about two people that wanted to give gifts to each other. So, something along the lines of, they give gifts to each other. Well, I can't simply say, se dan regalos, because dar is not a reflexive. So how am I going to convey this idea if the verb isn't reflexive? What we're going to do is we're going to use the expression dan regalos uno al otro. And this expression right here is going to convey that idea of each other. And I can use this expression when the verb I'm trying to use is not reflexive. If, for instance, the people are both feminine, we can also say una a la otra. The next thing that's important to realize about reflexives is that reflexives can be used in any tense. They're not just present tense conjugations. So, if we wanted to convey the idea that, well, maybe we had a bath, but it was last night, me bañé ayer. I bathed myself yesterday. So, we can use reflexive verbs in all the tenses that we're going to learn. Everything from present to preterite, imperfect, future, and conditional, and so on. So, they can be used in any of the tenses. That is also something that's important to remember. The next thing that we want to talk about is reflexives with body parts. Remember, one of the primary three uses of reflexives is reflexives that are true reflexives. In other words, we do the action of the verb to ourselves. And naturally, this comes in, a lot of the verbs that play a role in true reflexives are verbs where we are doing things such as washing our hair or brushing our teeth. When we do that, for instance, if we want to say that I wash my hair, if we were to do a direct translation of the sentence from Spanish to English, or from English to Spanish in this case, it would look something like this. Me lavo mi pelo. However, in Spanish, what we're going to do is, instead of this me, we're going to use the definite article. So the actual correct translation of this is me lavo el pelo. And the reason for that is because the verb is reflexive, we know that we're doing the action of the verb to ourselves. So to add this possessive in here, telling us whose hair it is actually redundant. Because we know the verb is reflexive, we know whose hair it already is. So the idea here is that reflexive with body parts, you're going to use the definite article, meaning el or la, los or las, and not the possessive me, tu, su, etc. And again, the reason for that is because it's redundant. We already know who the body part belongs to because the verb is reflexive. As was mentioned on a previous slide, one of the important things that happens with reflexive verbs is when verbs are reflexive verbs and when they're not reflexive verbs. And there are many examples of those. Most of them will fall into the true reflexive category. Take a look at the two sentences that we have here. Yo lavo el perro, me lavo los dientes. Notice that the first sentence is not reflexive. Notice there's no reflexive pronoun. In the second sentence, it is reflexive. Notice the may here, the reflexive pronoun may. Well, why is one sentence reflexive and the other one not? Well, the answer is that in the first sentence, yo lavo el perro, here he is, okay, he's getting a nice bath, that the verb is not reflexive because the person doing the action of the verb, they're not doing it to themselves. They're doing it to the dog, okay? Happy dog. In the second sentence, the person doing the action of the verb, they are doing it to themselves. That's making the verb reflexive. Me lavo los dientes. Well, in this case, he's brushing his teeth. We might want to change this here. He's actually washing his hair. Me lavo el pelo. So again, the big difference here that is important to note is when verbs are used reflexively versus not reflexively. If you see that reflexive pronoun in there, it tells us that whoever's doing the verb is doing it to themselves, and when the reflexive pronoun is not there, they're not doing it to themselves. The one thing that needs to be learned over time is which verbs are reflexive and not reflexive, which verbs can never be reflexive, and which verbs are only reflexive. The very last rule to be discussed for using reflexives is reflexives used as infinitives. In other words, how are reflexive used when they are not conjugated in a sentence? Like this one. I have to wake up. And the verb to wake up is despertarse. I'm actually going to pause the slide for a moment, and I want you to think about how this sentence might translate over and what might happen to this verb, despertarse. Now that I've given you a chance to think about it a little bit, what ends up happening is we have a sentence that looks like this. Yo tengo que. And again, we know the verb is despertarse. We're not going to conjugate it because what we're trying to say here is to wake up. That's not conjugated. But actually what we need to do is, when we write this verb, we need to make sure that our reflexive pronoun matches the rest of the sentence. And because this verb at the beginning here is an I, this reflexive pronoun at the end, se, needs to change over and become me. Yo tengo que despertarme. So again, when you use a reflexive verb in a sentence and you're not conjugating, you're leaving it as an infinitive, make sure that the reflexive pronoun that's at the end of the sentence matches the subjects of the rest of the sentence. For instance, if we just flip the sentence a little bit and we change the I to you, how might that affect despertarse at the end? Because we're now using you, we would change it to despertarse. Let me give you one example to try on your own. If we had something along the lines of, we need to go to bed. Try that one. We need to go to bed. Now, you've had a chance to work on this one. We're not conjugating to go to bed. We're leaving it in the infinitive. Verb is acostarse. necesitamos, not conjugated, acostar. And because we're doing it in nosotros, the we form, this se that's at the end needs to become nos. Necesitamos acostarnos. Okay, kids, well, as we said, reflexive verbs are almost like looking at a reflection of yourself in the mirror. They go back to the doer. So looking at my reflection, here I am. It's Russell from Up. And that's the end of our video presentation. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them in class as we move forward with the topic. Hope you enjoyed.